Let's begin then with a very brief introduction summarizing all the time periods for this presentation. We'll begin at minus 2100, that's 2100 years before the Common Era began. We're going to call that first time period the nomadic tribes. Why do we call it that? We'll find out as the presentation goes on. We'll give that period 400 years until we get to roughly minus 1700. When a new period starts, we'll call that period instead the period of the forefathers. Think of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, their wives of course, and their descendants to come. We'll give that period also 400 years until we get to roughly minus 1300, when a new period starts, and that will be called the fulfilled promise. God promised a promised land to the Jewish nation, the great-great-grandchildren of Abraham, and indeed he fulfilled his promise. That period will also last 400 years. You're seeing a pattern here, I hope, until we get to roughly minus 900, when we reach the best period in Jewish history, and that will be called the Golden Era. This coincides with the First Temple period. 400 years goes by until, roughly speaking, minus 500. When you reach a new period no longer as good as the gold, second rate, we'll call that the Silver Era, and that coincides with the Second Temple period. 400 years go by until roughly minus 100. This is 100 years before the start of the Common Era, and here starts the period of the Roman rule. The Romans will be in power for 400 years until we get to roughly 300, in positive numbers now, of the Common Era, and at that point we reach the Byzantine power. That period will last 400 years under Byzantine rule in the land of Israel until we get to the year 700 of the Common Era. That will be a new period where the Arabs come along from all different places and they take advantage of the country. 400 years goes by, and that brings it to 1100 of the Common Era. This is the Middle Age period. We're going to call it the religious rivalry. We'll see later on why we call it that. 4 centuries goes by there too, until we get to 1500, the period of desolation. That period of desolation lasts for 400 more years until you get to roughly 1900, which is about 100 years ago. We're going to call that returning. So far that period has lasted just 100 years. We will see as time goes on through the future of history how much longer that period lasts for. We can now therefore go back and look through each of the time periods and discuss what happened along the way. We start at minus 2100 because before that point we really have no information as to what happened in the land of Israel, and therefore we'll start at roughly 2100 years before the start of the Common Era. At that point we'll find the world had been spinning, but indeed the Middle East is where essentially most important stuff seemed to be happening. Middle East, Europe, North Africa. The truth is though, when you look at Asia, there are 3 sections to Asia, and correctly speaking we should be talking about the Near East, Middle East and Far East, which means that the land of Israel technically belongs to the very beginning of the Near East. There you see the land of Israel, a tiny little country, really in the middle of that very important intersection between Asia, Africa and Europe. And a tiny country indeed, without trying to enter into politics. This is pretty much the image of how today the land of Israel looks. This coincides with the early Bronze Era, where they began to use metal to make items rather than relying on brick and stone. Here we have certain age-old towns that were being built in those days. What was unique about towns in those days is that they were pretty much all surrounded by a major wall. We are familiar with the biblical story of what happened to the walls of Jericho when the Jewish people arrived some centuries later, and of course those walls fell. We can now move on and talk about other people who were at the time living in this region, and they were nomads, people living essentially looking for food and water, searching the area. Wherever they found it, they would stay for a time, and when they had none left, they would move on. At this time though, nomadic tribes were primarily based not in what we call today Central Israel, but actually further southwest in what's known as the Sinai Peninsula. We also find at this time biblical mention of the 7 nations that lived in Israel, again as nomadic tribes circling around the country looking for food and water. We do know what happened to these tribes. In fact, we know about Canaan, or Canaan as they're more commonly known in English. They took the coastal plain and most of the mainland Israel. Thus, that name became the most commonly used name for the land of Israel in those days. Even the Bible refers to Canaan as the land that we call today Israel. There were other tribes at the time who were circling the region, primarily living in the areas shown at the moment on the screen. But Girgashi, we don't really know what to do with them because we have no information about where they were, where they lived. The suspicion is they went off to the Far East and then faded away into oblivion forevermore. But they weren't the only tribes. There were many more smaller ones at this time too. And they're mentioned also in the Bible, in the Torah. We have their names. And what's unique about all these tribes is that no matter how big or small they were governed by one person who was in charge. He was their leader, their king, their ruler, and everything had to follow their direction. That will play a very important role in Jewish history. When the Jews come to the land of Israel, the idea, the concept of being run by a ruler, a king, becomes very, very important to the Jewish nation too. That brings us therefore to the end of a period that we called nomadic tribes. It began at roughly minus 2,100, and we said it lasted for 400 years. To help you memorize this time period, we'll use a very simple memory cue. We'll put 4 arrows all moving in different directions because that's what nomads did. They moved from place to place, and each place they went to, they found water and food, and if they didn't, they moved on to the next location. We therefore have reached the end of this period, and a new period starts at minus 1700. We'll call this period the period of the forefathers, and that period, of course, will last for 400 years. Why do we call it the period of the forefathers? Because this is the time when Abraham is sent by God on a mission. He immigrates to Israel, land of Israel, and essentially starts to inherit the land on behalf of his children and great-grandchildren who will be coming a few centuries later back to the land. He comes from what we call Turkey of today, comes through Israel, circulates down to Egypt for a time, but essentially fights the battle of the 4 kings versus the 5 kings during this whole time, essentially again inheriting the land on behalf of his great-great-grandchildren to come. Then comes his son Isaac, who leads a very different life, because after he had been a sacrifice on Moriah, what we call today Temple Mount, he couldn't leave the country, and therefore he spent the rest of his life in the land of Israel. He wasn't allowed to leave the country. He was too holy to leave to other lands around. He spent some time in Gerar, which is what we call today Gaza. However, most of his life he was in Be'er Sheva, just south of Jerusalem by just a few miles. Then comes his son. Here comes Jacob. Jacob did spend his life partly in Israel, but had to go northeast to get married, had to go southwest to Egypt during famine times. It was there that his son Joseph took care of him and his family, ensuring they had enough sustenance during severe famine in the region, after which eventually, of course, he died, and later his body was brought up to the land of Israel, and he was buried there. Well, there's tiny, the land of Israel, again, with today's imagery, based upon how it looks today. However, there's a huge area just southwest of Israel. We call that today the Sinai Peninsula, a desert land area. However, there is gigantic Egypt. Now let's be fair, although Egypt looks huge next to tiny land of Israel, in reality, we've got to be honest about it, Egypt has a tremendous amount of desert land that can't be used for any real purpose. It has a very well-known river, the Nile, running through the country, and at the very north end of the country, there we find today's Cairo, the capital city. Eventually, after 210 very tough years of slavery, the Jewish nation did leave Egypt and made their way into the Sinai Peninsula. It's somewhere in that region where the Jewish people then became a nation as they received the Torah, the Bible as we call it, at Mount Sinai. Let's summarize, therefore. This is the period of the forefathers, which began roughly at minus 1700. That period lasted 400 years, and the way we memorize this time period is with the number 1, because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they brought into the world a brand new concept, the idea of monotheism. And at a time where pretty much everyone around the entire globe was worshipping idolatry, it was a unique concept that Abraham introduced and passed on to his children and grandchildren forevermore. And indeed, therefore, since Abraham down till to this day, we can safely say that we only have one God in this world, and the Jewish people are only asking for one land of Israel. We've now reached the end of that period. We've now reached the year roughly minus 1300. A new period starts, and that's called the fulfilled promise because God promised the Jewish people a land, and he did fulfill it entirely. We'll cover that in the next video segment.